Every parent should see beauty in their child, but Oliver Whitfield saw only burden in his daughter's face. Sometimes the cruelest wounds come from those who should love us most. In 1887, 16-year-old Susanna was traded away like livestock to a giant cowboy named Gabriel Stone because her own father couldn't stand the sight of her. The town of Dry Hollow called her plain and worthless, but Gabriel saw something different. He saw a girl who deserved kindness in a world that had shown her none. What started as a cold business deal slowly became something beautiful. Gabriel gave Susanna the one thing she'd never had, someone who believed she mattered. Years passed, and that awkward girl grew into a woman of quiet strength. But would the love that saved her be enough to face the town that tried to destroy her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer heat pressed down on Dry Hollow like a heavy blanket, turning the dusty main street into a shimmering mirage of false promises. 16-year-old Susanna Whitfield swept the front porch of her father's general store with mechanical precision, her movements careful and quiet. She had learned long ago that drawing attention to herself only brought disappointment or worse. In the cracked window of the store, a faded daguerreotype of her mother caught the morning light. Margaret Whitfield had been beautiful. Everyone said so. Golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, eyes the color of summer sky, and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. The photograph showed her on her wedding day, radiant with joy and hope for the future she would never see. Susanna paused in her sweeping to study her reflection in the dusty glass beside her mother's image. Where Margaret had been delicate and fair, Susanna was angular and dark. Her brown hair hung in plain braids, her skin was touched by the sun from working outdoors, and her green eyes, her father's eyes, held none of her mother's gentle warmth. She was taller than most girls her age, with strong hands that spoke of hard work rather than gentle refinement. "Susanna!" Oliver Whitfield's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. "Get inside. Mrs. Patterson's coming for her order." She hurried through the door, setting the broom aside with practiced silence. Her father stood behind the counter, his graying hair disheveled and his clothes wrinkled from another night of drinking. The gold wedding band on his finger caught the light, a tarnished reminder of happier times he could never quite remove, though he never looked at it directly. Oliver Whitfield had been a different man once. Neighbors still remembered him as a young husband who would bring his pregnant wife wildflowers every evening, who would sing softly to her growing belly and speak of the beautiful child they would raise together. But Margaret's death in childbirth had broken something fundamental inside him, and 17 years of grief had turned that break into a chasm that seemed to widen with each passing day. Mrs. Patterson bustled through the door, her sharp eyes immediately finding fault. "Morning, Oliver. I see your girl's been sweeping again. Shame she can't sweep away that unfortunate look of hers as easily." Susanna felt the familiar sting of casual cruelty, but kept her expression neutral. In Dry Hollow, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to attract a husband, and at 16, Susanna had attracted no one. The young men of the town looked right through her, their eyes seeking prettier faces and more promising prospects. "She's useful enough," Oliver replied with the tone one might use to describe a sturdy mule. "Gets the work done." Mrs. Patterson collected her supplies, thread, buttons, and a small tin of tooth powder, while continuing her assessment. Margaret was such a beauty. Terrible how these things don't always pass down to the children. Still, the girl's young. Perhaps she'll improve with age. Susanna counted coins and wrapped purchases, her fingers steady despite the weight of the conversation. She had heard variations of this exchange countless times. The town had expectations for its daughters, and she had failed to meet them before. She was old enough to understand what was required. After Mrs. Patterson left, Oliver turned his attention to the ledger, his handwriting growing more erratic with each entry. The store provided a modest living, but barely enough to support two people, and certainly not enough to attract suitors interested in a comfortable dowry. Most families in Dry Hollow lived hand to mouth, working claims that promised more than they delivered, or running businesses that served a population too small to sustain real prosperity. "Father," Susanna ventured carefully, "shall I start inventory on the dry goods?" He looked up from the ledger, and for a moment his expression softened. In unguarded moments like these, she could see glimpses of the man her mother had loved. But then his gaze shifted to the photograph in the window, and the familiar hardness returned. "Do what you want," he said, turning back to his books. "Makes no difference either way." The morning wore on with its usual rhythm of small transactions and smaller conversations. Susanna restocked shelves, swept floors that never seemed to stay clean, and listened to the gossip that flowed through the store like water through a sieve. The widow Johnson was having trouble with her well. The Morrison family was considering pulling up stakes and heading further west, and there was talk of a new man in town, a giant of a fellow who had rented the old cabin outside of town and kept to himself. "Gabriel Stone, his name is," Mrs. Fletcher confided to Mrs. Davies as they examined a bolt of calico. "Rode in 3 days ago on the biggest horse I've ever seen, tall as a tree and twice as wide. Paid his rent in gold coin, if you can believe it." "What's his business here?" Mrs. Davies asked, lowering her voice. "Nobody knows. He's been to the saloon once, ordered one drink and left when some of the boys tried to make conversation. Polite enough, they said, but distant, like he's carrying something heavy." Susanna found herself curious about this Gabriel Stone despite herself. Dry Hollow rarely attracted strangers, and when it did, they usually passed through quickly. A man who would rent a cabin and pay in gold suggested someone planning to stay, which raised questions in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The afternoon brought the familiar weight of her father's disappointment. As Susanna prepared a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Oliver sat at their small table and stared out the window at nothing in particular. His drinking had gotten worse in recent months, and with it, his ability to pretend that his daughter's presence didn't pain him. "You're 17 next month," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Yes, father. Most girls your age are married by now, or at least spoken for." Susanna kept her attention on the beans, stirring them slowly to avoid scorching. "Yes, father. It's not natural. A girl your age with no prospects. Makes people talk." She had heard the talk, whispered speculation about what was wrong with Oliver Whitfield's daughter, that no man would have her. Suggestions that perhaps she was slow-minded or had some hidden flaw that made her unsuitable for marriage. The truth was simpler and more painful. She was plain in a place where prettiness was currency, and poor in a community where every family struggled to survive. "I could work harder in the store," she offered quietly. "Take on more of the burden." Oliver's laugh was bitter. "Work harder? Child, you already do the work of two people. That's not the problem. The problem, though he would never say it aloud, was that every time he looked at her, he saw Margaret's death. Susanna had her mother's stubborn chin and quick mind, but in Oliver's grief-clouded vision, she had become the reason his beloved wife was gone. Logic told him this was unfair. Margaret had been frail, and childbirth was dangerous for any woman, but grief had little use for logic. That evening, as Susanna mended a torn shirt by lamplight, Oliver made an announcement that would change everything. "I've been thinking," he said, not looking at her, "about your situation, about what's to become of you." Her needle paused in its work. Something in his tone warned her that this conversation would be different from their usual discussions about her unmarried state. "There's a man in town, the new fellow, Gabriel Stone. He's looking for someone to keep house for him. Cook, clean, manage his domestic affairs." Susanna's heart began to race, though she couldn't have said whether from hope or fear. "You spoke with him?" "Not yet. But I intend to. An arrangement like that could solve both your problems and mine." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Susanna understood the implications immediately. Her father was planning to hand her off to a stranger, not as a wife, but as unpaid domestic help. It would remove the burden of supporting her while solving the problem of her unmarried state. "What do you know about this man?" she asked carefully. "Enough. He pays his debts, keeps to himself, and needs what you can provide. It's a practical solution." Practical. The word felt like a stone in her chest. Her future reduced to a practical solution for her father's embarrassment and financial strain. And if he's not a good man? Oliver finally looked at her directly, and she saw something that might have been regret flicker across his features. "Life's not about good men, Susanna. It's about making the best of what's available. This Gabriel stone is available, and you need somewhere to go." That night, Susanna lay in her narrow bed and listened to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear her father moving restlessly, probably working his way through another bottle of whiskey. Tomorrow, he would speak with Gabriel Stone about an arrangement that would determine the rest of her life. She thought about her mother's photograph, forever young and hopeful in the store window. Margaret Whitfield had married for love, had been cherished and valued and mourned. Her daughter would be traded like goods to a stranger who needed his house kept clean. But perhaps, Susanna thought as sleep finally claimed her, a stranger's. Practical kindness might be better than a father's bitter disappointment. At least, Gabriel Stone would have no memories of a beautiful woman to compare her against. At least with him, she might find a place where she could simply exist without constant reminder of all the ways she had failed to live up to what came before. The morning would bring change, whether she was ready for it or not. The next morning brought the sound of heavy boots on the store's front porch. Susanna looked up from sorting bolts of fabric to see a figure that seemed to fill the entire doorway. Gabriel Stone was even larger than the gossips had described. Well, over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his worn workshirt. His dark hair was touched with early grey, and his weathered face spoke of years spent outdoors under harsh sun and bitter wind. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were deep brown, almost black, and held a careful stillness that reminded her of a wild animal deciding whether to trust or flee. There was intelligence there, and something else. A wariness that suggested he had learned to expect disappointment from the world. "Mr. Whitfield." His voice was quiet, surprisingly gentle for such a large man. Oliver emerged from the back room, straightening his vest in an attempt at respectability. "Mr. Stone, thank you for coming." Gabriel's gaze flickered briefly to Susanna, then back to her father. "You said you had a proposition to discuss." "Indeed I do. Perhaps we could speak privately. If it concerns your daughter, she should hear it." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. Oliver's face reddened slightly. Whether from embarrassment or anger, Susanna couldn't tell. "Very well. Susanna, come here." She approached slowly, studying Gabriel's face for any sign of the kind of man he might be. His expression remained neutral, but she noticed he kept his hands visible and made no sudden movements, as if he understood that his size might be intimidating. Oliver cleared his throat and began what was clearly a rehearsed speech. "Mr. Stone, my daughter is 17 years old, hard-working and skilled in all domestic arts. She can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household efficiently. She's also unmarried with no prospects on the horizon." Susanna felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but Gabriel's expression didn't change. "She needs a situation," Oliver continued, "and you need domestic help. I propose an arrangement that would benefit you both. In exchange for room, board, and a small wage, she would manage your household needs." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes moving from Oliver to Susanna and back again. "What kind of arrangement are you proposing exactly?" "A practical one. She would live in your household as a domestic servant. You would provide for her needs, and she would tend to yours. And her wishes in this matter." The question surprised everyone in the room. Oliver's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, while Susanna stared at Gabriel in shock. No one had ever asked what she wanted before. "Her wishes," Oliver finally managed. "She wishes to be useful and cared for naturally." Gabriel turned his attention fully to Susanna. "Is that true, miss? Is this what you want?" For a moment she couldn't speak. The directness of his gaze was unsettling, not unkind but penetrating, as if he could see straight through to whatever truth she might try to hide. "I want to be safe," she said finally, the honesty surprising her. "I want to be useful, and I want to be treated with basic decency." Something shifted in Gabriel's expression, a softening around his eyes that might have been understanding. "Those seem reasonable desires." Oliver, eager to close the deal, pressed forward. "Then we have an agreement. The terms we discussed yesterday." "We didn't discuss terms yesterday," Gabriel said quietly. "You mentioned the possibility of an arrangement. I said I would consider it." Of course, but surely—" Gabriel held up one large hand, stopping Oliver mid-sentence. "Miss Whitfield, would you step outside with me for a moment?" Susanna glanced at her father, who nodded impatiently. Gabriel opened the door and gestured for her to precede him onto the porch. The morning air was cooler there, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. "Your father seems eager to finalize this arrangement," Gabriel said, his voice even quieter outside. "He needs the burden lifted," she replied honestly. "I'm of an age where my unmarried state reflects poorly on our family." "Is that how you see yourself? As a burden?" The question was asked without judgment, but it struck her like a physical blow. She had never articulated it so clearly before, but yes, that was exactly how she saw herself. A burden her father couldn't afford to keep and couldn't manage to marry off. In practical terms, yes. Gabriel leaned against the porch railing, making himself smaller in the way very tall people sometimes do when talking to shorter companions. "Tell me about your practical terms. What would you expect from such an arrangement?" "A place to sleep, food to eat, and work that has purpose. Perhaps a small wage to put aside for my future." "And what would you offer in return?" "Honest work. I can cook well enough, keep a house clean and organized, mend clothes, tend a garden. I can read and cipher, so I could help with correspondence or accounts if needed." Gabriel nodded slowly. "What you're describing sounds more like a business partnership than domestic servitude." "I don't understand." "Your father is proposing to hand you over like property. You're describing a mutual arrangement between two people who could benefit from working together." The distinction was subtle but important, and Susanna felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. "What kind of man are you, Mr. Stone?" The question seemed to amuse him slightly. "That's a fair question, given the circumstances. I'm a man who values honesty, hard work, and treating people with respect. I don't drink to excess. I don't raise my hand to those weaker than myself. And I believe every person deserves dignity regardless of their station in life." "Why do you need someone to keep house for you?" "Because I'm better with horses and cattle than I am with cooking and cleaning. Because a man living alone tends to let things slide that shouldn't be let slide. And because," he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully, "because loneliness makes people hard in ways that aren't good for them." His honesty was startling. Most people in Dry Hollow guarded their vulnerabilities carefully, but Gabriel spoke of loneliness as casually as he might mention the weather. "Are you offering me the position?" she asked. "I'm considering it, but I want you to understand what you'd be agreeing to. You'd live in my house, but you'd have your own room with a lock on the door. You'd work hard, but no harder than any woman managing her own household. And you'd be paid a fair wage, not just room and board, but actual money that would be yours to keep or spend as you see fit." Susanna stared at him, trying to comprehend a world where her labor would be valued rather than simply expected. "Why would you offer such terms?" "Because fair dealing makes for better partnerships, and because I suspect you've had precious little fair dealing in your life." Before she could respond, Oliver appeared in the doorway, impatience written across his features. "Have you reached a decision?" Gabriel straightened to his full height. "I have. Miss Whitfield, if you're agreeable, I'd like to offer you a position managing my household." The terms are room, board, and $10 a month in wages. You'd have Sundays free and your own private quarters. The arrangement would be reviewed after 6 months to ensure it's working for both parties. Oliver's eyes widened at the mention of wages. $10 a month was more than many men in Dry Hollow earned. That's very generous. It's fair compensation for valuable work. Susanna felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This conversation had taken a turn she never could have anticipated. Instead of being handed off like unwanted goods, she was being offered terms that suggested she had worth beyond her ability to sweep floors and cook meals. "I accept," she said quietly. Gabriel nodded once, then reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "I took the liberty of writing up an agreement outlining the terms we discussed. If you're both satisfied with it, we can sign it and make this official." Oliver snatched the paper and read it quickly, his expression growing more surprised with each line. The document was clearly written and legally sound, laying out expectations and protections for both parties. Most importantly, it included a clause stating that either party could terminate the arrangement with 2 weeks' notice. "This is quite formal," Oliver said. "Important agreements should be formal," Gabriel replied. "It protects everyone involved." With hands that shook slightly, whether from relief or anxiety, she couldn't tell, Susanna signed her name to the contract that would change her life. Gabriel's signature was bold and clear, his handwriting suggesting education and refinement that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "When would you like me to start?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if that suits you. That will give you time to gather your belongings and say your goodbyes." As Gabriel Stone walked away, his signed contract tucked safely in his vest pocket, Susanna watched him with a mixture of hope and terror. In less than an hour, her entire future had been rewritten. Tomorrow, she would leave the only home she had ever known to begin a new life with a man who saw her as a person rather than a burden. For the first time in years, that life seemed to hold possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The ride to Gabriel's homestead took nearly an hour, winding through scrub brush and rocky terrain that gradually gave way to greener pasture land. Susanna sat sideways on the back of his massive bay horse, her few belongings tied in a bundle. Behind the saddle, Gabriel had fashioned a makeshift seat for her comfort, demonstrating the same careful consideration he had shown during their negotiations. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, though it was filled with unspoken questions. Susanna found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, seeing it not as the familiar territory around Dry Hollow, but as the approach to her new life. The mountains in the distance seemed less forbidding somehow, their peaks catching the afternoon light in shades of purple and gold. Gabriel's homestead surprised her. She had expected something rough and temporary, the kind of shelter a drifter might throw together for a season or two. Instead, she found a modest but well-built cabin with a solid stone foundation, glass windows, and a covered porch that suggested permanence. The surrounding property showed signs of careful planning, a kitchen garden already planted and thriving, a small barn and corral for horses, and the beginnings of what looked like a larger structure intended for cattle. "You built this yourself?" she asked as Gabriel helped her down from the horse. Most of it had help with the heavy timber work. He untied her bundle and handed it to her. "I know it's not much compared to town living, but it's sound and it's clean." Susanna looked around the small clearing with its neat fences and purposeful buildings. "It's more than I expected." Gabriel led her toward the cabin, pausing at the front steps. "Before we go inside, I want to show you something." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft cloth. "I made this some years back for a child who didn't live to play with it." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a hand-carved wooden horse, its details lovingly crafted down to the flowing mane and alert ears. The wood had been sanded smooth and stained a warm honey color, and tiny leather reins hung from the carved bridle. "It's beautiful," Susanna said, meaning it completely. "I kept it because—" Gabriel paused, seeming to search for the right words. Because it reminded me that I could create something gentle, even after all the violence I'd seen. I'm showing it to you because I want you to understand the kind of man I'm trying to be here." The weight of this revelation settled over her. This was not just a toy. It was a testament to loss, to hope, and to the deliberate choice to nurture rather than destroy. Gabriel rewrapped the horse carefully and returned it to his saddlebag. "Come," he said quietly. "Let me show you your new home." The inside of the cabin was as surprising as the outside. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace providing heat for cooking and warmth. The furniture was simple but well made, much of it clearly crafted by Gabriel's own hands. Everything was scrupulously clean and organized, though there was a masculine starkness to the space that spoke of a man living alone. "Your room is through here," Gabriel said, leading her to a door off the main room. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a porcelain pitcher and bowl, and most importantly, a sturdy lock on the inside of the door. "The previous owner's wife left some things behind," Gabriel explained, gesturing to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. "Dresses and such. You're welcome to use whatever fits or suits you." Susanna set her bundle on the bed and turned to face him. "Mr. Stone, I need to ask you something directly." "Gabriel," he corrected gently, "and ask whatever you need to ask. What do you expect from me? Not the work. I understand about cooking and cleaning. But what do you expect from me as a person, living in your house?" Gabriel leaned against the doorframe, careful to stay in clear view rather than entering her private space. "I expect you to do your work honestly and well. I expect you to speak up if something isn't right, or if you need something I haven't provided. And I expect you to understand that this is your home now, not just a place where you work. And what should I expect from you? Respect, fair treatment, protection if you need it, and patience while we both figure out how to make this arrangement work." Something in his tone made her believe him. There was no false charm or calculated kindness, just straightforward honesty from a man who seemed to understand that trust had to be earned rather than demanded. "There's something else you should know," Gabriel continued. "I'm not much for conversation at meals. I've lived alone too long to be comfortable with chatter. But that doesn't mean I don't want to hear what you have to say when you have something." "Worth saying?" Susanna nodded, understanding. "Comfortable silence is better than forced conversation." "Exactly." Gabriel pushed himself away from the doorframe. "I'll let you settle in. When you're ready, perhaps you could look over the kitchen and let me know what supplies you'll need. I usually ride into town on Saturdays for provisions." After he left, Susanna sat on the edge of her new bed and tried to process the magnitude of change in her life. 24 hours ago, she had been her father's unwanted burden. Now she was a valued employee with her own room, fair wages, and what appeared to be genuine respect from her employer. She opened the wooden chest Gabriel had mentioned and found it full of women's clothing in various sizes. The dresses were simple but well made, in practical colors that would show less dirt and wear. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in tissue paper, she found something that made her breath catch, a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. The locket opened to reveal a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and gentle features. A slip of paper tucked beside the portrait read, "For Margaret's daughter, when she's old enough to know her mother's heart. Love, Aunt Catherine." Susanna stared at the locket in amazement. This was her mother's sister, whom she had never known existed. Her father had never mentioned any family beyond his own parents, who had died when Susanna was small. The discovery of this hidden connection to her mother felt like a gift beyond measure. She fastened the locket around her neck and felt an immediate sense of connection to the woman she had never been allowed to truly know. Perhaps here, in this place where she was valued for herself, rather than judged for her failure to live up to someone else's memory, she could finally begin to understand who Margaret Whitfield had been beyond the beautiful young woman in the store window photograph. That evening, Susanna prepared her first meal in Gabriel's kitchen. Simple fare of salt pork, beans and cornbread, but seasoned with herbs from the garden and served with attention to presentation that had been impossible in her father's neglected household. Gabriel ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting the seasoning and asking about her methods without making the conversation feel forced. As they sat in comfortable quiet after the meal, Susanna realized that for the first time in years, she felt the possibility of belonging somewhere. Gabriel Stone might be a mystery, but he was a mystery who treated her with dignity, and that alone was more than she had dared to hope for. Outside, the evening settled over the mountains with the promise of rain, and inside the solid cabin, two solitary people began the delicate process of learning to share space with kindness rather than mere tolerance. The first week of Susanna's new life fell into a rhythm that surprised her with its natural ease. Gabriel rose before dawn to tend his horses and check the small herd of cattle that grazed in the distant pasture. By the time he returned for breakfast, she had coffee brewing and fresh biscuits warming by the fire. He would eat quietly, sometimes sharing observations about the weather or the condition of his stock, but never demanding conversation when she wasn't inclined to provide. After breakfast, Gabriel would disappear for hours at a time, working on the endless tasks that came with maintaining a frontier homestead. Susanna threw herself into organizing and improving the domestic sphere with an enthusiasm that surprised her. For the first time in her life, her work felt purposeful rather than merely dutiful. She discovered that Gabriel was a man of hidden depths. His bookshelf held volumes of poetry alongside practical texts on animal husbandry and farming techniques. His kitchen was well equipped with tools that spoke of someone who understood the importance of proper preparation, even if he lacked the skill to use them effectively. Most telling of all, she found evidence of a gentleman's education in the careful way he maintained his accounts and correspondence. On the fourth morning, while exploring the cabin more thoroughly, Susanna discovered something that made her understand Gabriel's careful boundaries even better. Tucked away in a wooden box beneath his bed, which she was cleaning after he had specifically requested that she not worry about his personal space, she found a leather-bound journal filled with pressed flowers and delicate handwriting. The key journal belonged to her mother. Margaret Whitfield's diary chronicled the months leading up to her marriage, revealing a love story that Oliver had never shared with his daughter. Page after page detailed tender courtship, shared dreams, and the quiet joy of a woman who knew herself to be cherished. The final entries spoke of pregnancy with wonder and anticipation, with no hint of the tragedy that awaited. "I pray this child will have Oliver's steadfast heart and my love of beautiful things," read one entry dated just weeks before Susanna's birth. "Already I can feel the strength in this little one, such determined kicks and turns. Oliver speaks to my belly each night, telling our child about the world we're preparing. We have chosen names, Susanna for a girl, after the biblical woman who was brave enough to stand for what was right, and Thomas for a boy, after Oliver's father who taught him that kindness is the truest mark of strength." Susanna sat on Gabriel's carefully made bed, holding her mother's words and understanding for the first time that she had been wanted, planned for, and loved even before her birth. The tragedy was not that Margaret had died giving her life, but that Oliver had been unable to separate his grief from his love for the daughter who carried his wife's dreams. "Find something interesting?" Gabriel's voice from the doorway made her jump. She had been so absorbed in the journal that she hadn't heard him return from the pasture. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, closing the book. "I was cleaning and I found—" "Your mother's journal," Gabriel finished quietly. "I wondered when you'd come across it. You have my mother's journal." "How?" Gabriel entered the room slowly, his large frame somehow managing not to seem threatening in the small space. "Your father was burning her things one night about 3 years ago. He was drunk and angry, standing in the street throwing her belongings into a fire. Mrs. Fletcher and I managed to save a few items before he could destroy everything." Why would he burn her things? Grief makes people do foolish things sometimes. Oliver couldn't bear the reminders, but he also couldn't bear to give them away properly. Burning them felt like the only solution. Susanna looked down at the journal in her hands. "Have you read it?" "No, it wasn't meant for me." Gabriel sat carefully on the edge of his own bed, maintaining respectful distance. "I kept it hoping that someday you might want to know more about your mother than what other people chose to tell you." The kindness of this gesture, preserving her mother's private thoughts for years on the chance that they might someday comfort her daughter, struck Susanna as profoundly generous. "Thank you," she said, meaning it completely. "She loved you before you were born," Gabriel said simply. That much was clear even to those of us who barely knew her. Whatever your father's struggles, they don't diminish that love. Susanna spent the rest of that afternoon reading her mother's journal from beginning to end, learning about the woman who had shaped her existence, but whom she had never been allowed to truly know. Margaret emerged from the pages as intelligent, kind, and possessed of a quiet strength that Susanna recognized in herself. That evening, emboldened by Gabriel's continued respect for her dignity, she asked him the question that had been growing in her mind all week. "Why did you really agree to this arrangement? Not the practical reasons you gave my father, but the real reason." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire he had built against the evening chill. "Because I knew what it felt like to be discarded by people who should have protected you," he said finally, "and because I could see that you deserved better than what you were getting. You were discarded too. In a manner of speaking, different circumstances, but the feeling is the same." Susanna waited, sensing that Gabriel was deciding how much of his story to share. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "I had a family once, a wife and a baby daughter. They died of fever while I was away fighting in the war. When I came home, my wife's family blamed me for not being there to protect them. My own family thought I should have died with honor in battle, rather than surviving to come home to an empty house. There wasn't a place for me anywhere, so I made my own place." The simple recounting of such profound loss took Susanna's breath away. "I'm sorry," she said inadequately. "It was a long time ago. But it taught me that sometimes the people who matter most are the ones who choose to value you, not the ones who are supposed to by blood or obligation." That night, as Susanna lay in her comfortable bed, reading her mother's journal by lamplight, she began to understand that she and Gabriel were both refugees from families that had failed them. Perhaps that shared understanding was what made their unlikely partnership feel less strange than it should have. For the first time since leaving her father's house, she began to believe that she might have found not just employment, but something approaching home. 3 weeks into her new life, Susanna caught her reflection in the kitchen window and barely recognized herself. The constant worry lines that had marked her face since childhood had begun to smooth. Her posture was straighter, her movements more confident. Most remarkably, she had begun to smile without thinking about it first. The transformation wasn't just physical. Gabriel's consistent respect and the purposeful nature of her work had awakened something in her that she hadn't known existed, a sense of her own worth that went beyond mere usefulness. When Gabriel asked her opinion about improving the kitchen or reorganizing the storage shed, he listened to her answers as if they mattered. When she suggested modifications to their daily routine that would make the household run more efficiently, he implemented them without question. It was during one of these conversations, as they planned the layout for an expanded vegetable garden, that trouble arrived in the form of Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Fletcher. The two women approached the cabin on foot, their faces set in expressions of determined moral concern. Susanna saw them coming from the kitchen window and felt her newfound confidence waver. In Dry Hollow, visits from the town's moral authorities rarely brought good news. "Susanna," Gabriel said quietly, appearing at her shoulder. He had seen them too. "Remember that you owe them no explanations beyond common courtesy." The reminder steadied her. She smoothed her apron, one of the better dresses from the chest, which fit her perfectly and made her feel properly dressed for the first time in years, and stepped onto the porch with Gabriel beside her. "Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Fletcher," she greeted them politely. "What brings you so far from town?" Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes took in every detail of Susanna's appearance, from her neat hair to her clean dress to the confident way she stood. "We've come to check on your welfare, dear. There's been talk in town about your situation here." "What kind of talk?" Gabriel's voice was calm, but Susanna heard the warning beneath it. "The kind that concerns proper Christian women when a young unmarried girl is living alone with a man of uncertain character," Mrs. Fletcher replied tartly, "especially when that girl seems to have improved considerably since taking up residence here." The implication was clear. In the minds of these women, Susanna's visible well-being could only be explained by improper relations with Gabriel. The cruel irony that she was thriving precisely because Gabriel treated her with respect rather than taking advantage was lost on them entirely. "I can assure you that Miss Whitfield's welfare is my primary concern," Gabriel said evenly. "She has her own quarters, fair wages, and complete protection of her virtue." "So you say," Mrs. Patterson sniffed. "But appearances matter, Mr. Stone. A girl her age, unmarried, living in the household of a bachelor. It creates talk whether or not anything improper is actually occurring." Susanna felt the familiar burn of shame beginning in her chest, but then something unexpected happened. Gabriel stepped slightly forward, not blocking her, but clearly positioning himself as her defender. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made both women step back involuntarily. "Miss Whitfield is under my protection. Any talk that impugns her character will be considered a personal insult to me. I trust I make myself clear." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Both women understood that Gabriel Stone was not a man to cross lightly. Mrs. Fletcher, apparently the braver of the two, tried a different approach. "Surely you understand our concern, Mr. Stone. Susanna has always been, well, plain is perhaps the kindest word. To see her looking so much better raises questions about the nature of her improvement." "The nature of her improvement," Gabriel said with dangerous calm, "is that she's being treated with the respect and kindness every person deserves. If that's unusual enough in your experience to cause suspicion, perhaps you should examine your own assumptions about how people should be treated." Susanna found her voice, strengthened by Gabriel's support. "Mrs. Fletcher, Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I can assure you that Mr. Stone has been nothing but honorable in his treatment of me. I have meaningful work, fair compensation, and for the first time in my life I feel valued for who I am, rather than criticized for who I'm not." Mrs. Patterson's expression soured. "Pretty words, but the fact remains that this arrangement is irregular. A proper young woman would seek employment in a respectable household with other women present, not isolate herself with a bachelor of questionable background." "What do you know of my background?" Gabriel asked, his tone sharpening. "We know you. Appeared in our town with no references, no family connections, and no clear explanation of your business here. We know you pay in gold coins when most honest men deal in paper money or trade. And we know you've taken in a girl who should be seeking a husband, not playing house with a stranger." Gabriel was very still for a moment, and Susanna sensed the careful control he was exercising over his temper. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "My business in this territory is my own affair, conducted within the bounds of law and common decency. Miss Whitfield's employment with me is documented in a legal contract that protects both her interests and mine. If you have specific accusations to make them. If not, I suggest you return to town and find more productive uses for your time." Mrs. Fletcher, recognizing that they had pushed as far as they dared, gathered her dignity around her like a cloak. "We're simply concerned citizens, Mr. Stone. When we see a young woman's reputation at risk, her reputation is at risk." From gossips, not from honest employment, Gabriel cut her off. Good day, ladies. After the women left, Susanna found herself shaking with a mixture of anger and lingering shame. The encounter had reminded her forcefully that the world beyond Gabriel's homestead still saw her as they always had. A problem. To be solved or a scandal to be prevented. They'll spread talk, she said quietly. Let them. Talk can't hurt you here, but it could hurt you. Association with me. Gabriel turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious. Susanna, listen to me carefully. I chose this arrangement because I believed it would benefit us both. I've seen nothing in these past weeks to change that opinion. In fact, I've seen considerable evidence that my initial judgment was correct. What do you mean? I mean that you've brought order and comfort to my household, intelligence and kindness to my daily life, and a sense of purpose I hadn't realized I was missing. If the good people of Dry Hollow choose to see scandal in that, it says more about their limited imagination than it does about either of us. That evening, as Susanna prepared dinner, she found herself thinking about the silver locket around her neck and the mother she was finally getting to know through her journal. Margaret Whitfield had been brave enough to marry for love in a time when practical considerations usually took precedence. Perhaps her daughter could be brave enough to stay where she was valued, regardless of what others might say. The future might be uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Susanna felt she had someone standing beside her as she faced it. The morning after the confrontation with the town ladies, Susanna woke to find Gabriel already gone, and a note on the kitchen table written in his careful script. Gone to check the north pasture fence. Back by evening. There's something in my room I'd like you to see when you have time. Curious and slightly apprehensive, Susanna finished her morning chores before approaching Gabriel's bedroom. On his dresser, positioned where she couldn't miss it, lay a small wooden box she had never seen before. Inside, wrapped in faded blue silk, was a military medal, the Congressional Medal of Honor, along with official papers documenting Gabriel's service record. The documents told a story that took her breath away. Sergeant Gabriel Stone, 5th Pennsylvania, volunteer infantry, had distinguished himself at the Battle of Gettysburg by single-handedly holding a strategic position against overwhelming Confederate forces, saving his entire company from certain destruction. The official commendation spoke of extraordinary heroism in the face of mortal danger and selfless devotion to duty that exemplifies the highest ideals of military service. But it was the personal letter tucked beneath the medal that revealed the true cost of Gabriel's heroism. Written in a shaking hand by his former commanding officer, it read, Gabriel, I know you blame yourself for surviving when so many good men didn't. I know you carry the weight of every man who fell while you lived, but you must understand that your actions that day saved dozens of lives. Your survival wasn't luck or cowardice. It was Providence ensuring that someone worthy would live to honor the memory of those we lost. The war changed all of us, but it didn't break you. Don't let guilt finish what enemy bullets couldn't. Colonel James Morrison. Susanna sank into Gabriel's reading chair, the medal heavy in her hands. This explained so much. His careful control, his protective instincts, his ability to see worth in people others discarded. Gabriel wasn't just a kind man. He was a genuine hero who carried the burden of survival with the same careful honor he brought to everything else in his life. When Gabriel returned that evening, he found her waiting with his medal displayed respectfully on the kitchen table. Between them, you left this for me to find, she said without preamble. I did. Why? Gabriel settled into his chair across from her, his large hands folding carefully in his lap. Because after yesterday, I realized you might wonder what kind of man you're trusting with your safety. I thought you deserved to know the whole truth. The whole truth about your war service? Or the whole truth about why you live like a man with something to prove? The perceptive question seemed to surprise him. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to gauge how much honesty she could handle. Both, I suppose. I survived battles that killed better men than me. I came home to find my family dead and my community unwilling to welcome back a man who'd seen too much killing. I've spent the last 15 years trying to build something worthy of the life I was allowed to keep. Is that why you helped me? As some kind of penance? No, Gabriel's response was immediate and firm. I helped you because you deserved help. But I won't lie and say that giving you a chance to build a better life doesn't feel like one of the worthiest things I've done with my survival. Susanna traced the ribbon of the medal with one finger, thinking about the weight of carrying other people's lives in your memory. Do you ever regret it? Surviving when others didn't? Every day. But I've learned that regret is a luxury I can't afford. The dead don't need my guilt. They need me to live in a way that honors what they died protecting. What did they die protecting? The idea that people should be free to build lives worth living. That strength should be used to protect rather than exploit. That everyone deserves dignity, regardless of their station. Gabriel paused, then added quietly, the same things I'm trying to protect by keeping you safe here. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at speed. Gabriel was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. What he saw there made his expression harden. Your father's coming. He's not alone. Susanna joined him at the window to see Oliver Whitfield, riding hard toward the cabin, accompanied by two men she didn't recognize. Even from a distance, she could see that her father was agitated, his posture speaking of anger and desperation. Stay inside, Gabriel said, checking to ensure his sidearm was properly positioned. Whatever he wants, let me handle it. But Susanna had spent too many years reading her father's moods to mistake this particular storm. No, she said firmly. This concerns me directly. I won't hide while you face whatever he's brought. Gabriel looked as if he might argue, then seemed to reconsider. Very well, but stay behind me. And if things turn ugly, get to your room and lock the door. They met, Oliver and his companions on the front porch. Up close, Susanna could see that her father had been drinking heavily, and his companions, rough men she didn't recognize from Dry Hollow, carried themselves with the casual menace of hired muscle. Susanna, Oliver called out, his voice slurred, but determined. Pack your things. You're coming home. I am home, she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Don't be foolish, girl. This arrangement was a mistake. I found you a proper situation. Gabriel stepped slightly forward, not blocking Susanna, but making his protective stance clear. Miss Whitfield is under contract to me, Whitfield. Any changes to that arrangement require her consent. One of Oliver's companions, a lean man with cold eyes and a gun worn low on his hip, spoke up. The girl's father has rights, mister, legal rights to determine her situation. Not when she's of age and has entered into a legal employment contract, Gabriel replied calmly, which she has. Oliver fumbled in his vest pocket and produced a crumpled paper. I've got a buyer for the store, moving to San Francisco to live with my brother. Susanna comes with me, or she gets left behind with nothing. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Susanna felt the familiar churning of fear and obligation that had governed her entire life under her father's roof. But then she felt the solid presence of Gabriel beside her and remembered the medal lying on the kitchen table, proof that sometimes good people fought for what was right, even when the odds were against them. Then I suppose I'll be left behind, she said clearly, because this is where I choose to stay. Oliver's face darkened with fury. You ungrateful! The lady has made her choice, Gabriel interrupted, his voice carrying unmistakable warning. I suggest you respect it. The tension stretched taut as a violin string, and Susanna realized they were balanced on the edge of violence. But she also realized that for the first time in her life, she had someone willing to stand with her against the people who would control her future. Whatever came next, she would face it as a woman who had finally learned her own worth. The standoff might have escalated into violence if not for the arrival of an unexpected rider. Marshal Thomas Wade appeared over the ridge at a gallop, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind him rode two more men. One Susanna recognized as the territorial judge, the other a stranger in a dark suit who carried himself with official authority. "Whitfield," the marshal called out as he reined in his horse. "Stand down, you're under arrest." Oliver's face went white. "Arrest? On what charges?" The stranger in the dark suit dismounted and approached with deliberate calm. "Oliver Whitfield, I'm Federal Marshal William Hayes. You're wanted for questioning in connection with a robbery that occurred in Denver 3 months ago." Gabriel's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, then stopped as he processed what he was hearing. Susanna felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her father, a criminal. "This is ridiculous," Oliver blustered, but his voice carried none of his earlier conviction. "I've never been to Denver in my life." Marshal Hayes reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, a wanted poster that made Susanna's blood run cold. The face sketched there was unmistakably her father's, though the name beneath read Oscar Whitman. 3 months ago, a man matching your description robbed the Denver Mercantile Bank of $8,000 in gold. Witnesses described a man with graying hair, green eyes, and a distinctive scar on his left hand. Hayes gestured toward Oliver's hand, where indeed a pale scar marked his knuckles. The same man was seen at the Cattleman's Hotel the night before the robbery, registering under the name Oscar Whitman. One of Oliver's hired companions was already backing his horse away, clearly wanting no part of whatever was unfolding. The other man, the cold-eyed gunfighter, looked as if he might be calculating the odds of shooting his way out of the situation. "I was never in Denver," Oliver repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. Judge Harrison, a stern man Susanna recognized from town meetings, spoke up. "Mr. Whitfield, we also have reports that you've been paying debts around Dry Hollow with gold coins of unusual mint markings. The same mint markings found on coins stolen from the Denver bank." Gabriel stepped forward slightly, his voice carefully controlled. "Marshal, what does this have to do with Miss Whitfield?" "That depends," Marshal Hayes replied. "Miss, did you know about your father's recent travels? Any trips he might have taken without informing the community?" Susanna's mind raced back over the past few months. There had been a week in March when her father had disappeared, claiming he was visiting suppliers in Cheyenne. He had returned with money to pay several overdue accounts, explaining that he had collected on old debts. She had been so relieved that their financial situation had improved that she hadn't questioned the explanation. "There was a trip to Cheyenne in March," she said reluctantly. "He was gone for nearly a week." "Cheyenne is 2 days' ride from Denver," Judge Harrison noted grimly. Oliver's face crumpled as he realized the weight of evidence against him. The cold-eyed gunfighter chose that moment to make his move, reaching for his weapon with deadly intent. But Gabriel was faster. In one fluid motion, Gabriel drew his sidearm and fired, the bullet taking the gunfighter in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The man hit the ground hard, his gun flying wide, and lay groaning in the dust. "Jesus," Marshal Wade breathed. "That was some shooting." Gabriel holstered his weapon with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything else. "He was going for his gun. I couldn't let him threaten the lady." The remaining hired man threw up his hands in surrender, clearly wanting no part of further violence. Marshal Hayes moved quickly to secure both prisoners, while Judge Harrison approached Oliver with grim purpose. "Oliver Whitfield, you are under arrest for bank robbery and transportation of stolen goods across territorial lines. You have the right to legal representation." The judge's voice carried the weight of official judgment. "Given the serious nature of these charges, you'll be transported to Denver to stand trial." As the reality of the situation sank in, Oliver turned to Susanna with an expression that mixed desperation with something that might have been genuine regret. "Susanna, I never meant for any of this to touch you. The store, our debts. I was drowning, and I saw a chance to fix everything at once. By robbing a bank?" The words came out harsher than she intended, but the betrayal cut deep. Her father hadn't just been cruel and neglectful, he had been a criminal, putting both their lives at risk. I thought I could get away clean, pay off our debts, maybe even find you a proper dowry so some decent man would have you. I never planned for it to go this far. Gabriel's voice cut through Oliver's explanation with quiet authority. Marshal, here's what happens to Miss Whitfield now. She had no knowledge of her father's crimes. That's clear enough, the Marshal replied. She's not under suspicion, but he paused, considering the implications. With her father facing prison time, she'll need to make arrangements for her own support. She has arrangements, Gabriel said firmly. She's in my employ under legal contract with proper compensation and protection. Judge Harrison looked between Gabriel and Susanna with shrewd eyes. Miss Whitfield, is this arrangement satisfactory to you? You're free to make other choices if you prefer. Susanna looked at her father, slumped in defeat on his horse, with his hands bound behind him. She thought of the store in town that would now be seized by territorial authorities as part of his criminal proceedings. She thought of the life she had lived there, unloved, unwanted, and constantly reminded of her inadequacies. Then she looked at Gabriel, who had risked his own safety to protect her, who had given her dignity when her own father saw her only as a burden, who had shown her that she was capable of being valued for who she was, rather than criticized for who she wasn't. This arrangement is more than satisfactory, she said clearly. This is my home now, and Mr. Stone is the closest thing to family I have. Something passed across Gabriel's face at her words. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. Oliver made a sound that might have been a sob. Susanna, her father said brokenly, I know I've been a poor father to you. I know I let my grief over your mother poison the way I treated you. If I could undo— You can't, she interrupted, but not unkindly. What's done is done, father. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences. As do I. Marshal Hayes began preparing to transport his prisoners, but before leaving, he handed Gabriel an official document. This is a federal warrant authorizing us to search Whitfield's property for evidence of the robbery. We found most of the stolen gold hidden in his cellar, but there might be other evidence. The store and its contents will be held pending trial. As the law enforcement party rode away with Oliver and his accomplices, Susanna and Gabriel stood in the settling dust, watching her old life disappear over the horizon. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Are you all right? Gabriel asked finally. Susanna considered the question seriously. Her father was a criminal facing years in prison. Her childhood home would be seized by authorities. Everything she had known before coming to Gabriel's homestead was gone, swept away by revelations she could never have imagined. I think I am, she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. For the first time in my life, I think I actually am all right. Gabriel nodded slowly, understanding more than she had said. Then we'll make the best of what comes next. That evening, as they sat by the fire processing the day's shocking revelations, Susanna realized that her father's crimes had paradoxically set her free. There was no going back to her old life now, no possibility of returning to the store and the familiar patterns of disappointment and neglect. For better or worse, Gabriel Stone and this remote homestead were her future now. And for the first time since her mother's death, that future felt like it might hold real possibilities for happiness. 2 months passed in relative peace after Oliver's arrest. Susanna threw herself into creating a true home from Gabriel's practical homestead, while he worked with quiet determination to expand their small operation into something that could support them both comfortably. The rhythm of their days had grown natural and comfortable, marked by shared meals, companionable conversation, and the deep satisfaction that came from meaningful work. But their tranquil existence was shattered on a crisp October morning when Marshal Hayes returned, his face grim with news that would test everything they had built together. Miss Whitfield, Mr. Stone, the Marshal greeted them as they met him on the porch. I am afraid I bring troubling news about your father's case, Susanna. felt Gabriel tense beside her. "Has something happened to him?" she asked, surprised to find she still cared about Oliver's welfare despite everything. "No, he's alive and as well as can be expected. But during his interrogation, he revealed information that puts both of you in considerable danger." Marshal Hayes dismounted and approached the porch with the careful gait of a man carrying heavy news. "It seems your father wasn't working alone in the Denver robbery." Gabriel's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. "Who was working with him?" "A man named Jake Morrison. No relation to your former commanding officer," the marshal added, noting Gabriel's sharp look. "Morrison is the leader of a gang that specializes in bank robberies across 3 territories. When your father failed to return to their rendezvous point, Morrison assumed he'd been caught or killed. But now word has gotten out that Oliver Whitfield is talking to federal authorities." "What does that mean for us?" Susanna asked, though she suspected she already knew. "It means Morrison and his gang are coming here. They want to silence your father before he can implicate them further, and they want to recover their share of the stolen gold. Oliver told them he hid part of the money here on your property." Gabriel's expression hardened into something Susanna had never seen before, the cold calculation of a man preparing for war. "How many men are we talking about?" "Morrison typically travels with 4 or 5 others, all experienced killers, all wanted for multiple murders in addition to robbery." Marshal Hayes pulled a bundle of papers from his coat. "I've brought wanted posters so you'll know what you're dealing with." The faces staring back from the crude drawings were hard and merciless, men who killed as easily as they breathed. Susanna felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized the magnitude of the danger heading toward their peaceful homestead. "When will they arrive?" Gabriel asked, already shifting into what Susanna recognized as military planning mode. "Could be any time. They were spotted 3 days' ride south of here, asking questions about Oliver Whitfield. My guess is they'll arrive within the next day or 2. Gabriel studied the wanted posters with professional attention. "What kind of weapons are they carrying?" "Rifles, revolvers, and enough ammunition for a prolonged fight. Morrison himself is known for using dynamite to open bank vaults. He might have some with him." "Dynamite," Gabriel repeated grimly. "That changes things considerably." Marshal Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Stone, I have to be honest with you. I can't spare enough men to provide adequate protection here. The territorial government is stretched thin, with Indian troubles to the west and cattle rustlers to the east. I can offer to escort Miss Whitfield to safety in Cheyenne, where she could stay until this situation is resolved." "No." Susanna's voice was firm and immediate. "I won't be driven from my home by criminals." Gabriel turned to her with surprise and something that might have been pride. "Susanna, this isn't like dealing with gossips from town. These men will kill anyone who gets in their way. Then we don't get in their way. We stop them before they can threaten anyone else." The quiet determination in her voice seemed to settle something in Gabriel's mind. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you're staying, then we need to prepare properly." "Marshal, how much time do we have?" "Probably until tomorrow night, possibly less if they push their horses hard." Gabriel began pacing the porch, his mind clearly working through tactical considerations. "The cabin is defensible, but not against dynamite. We'll need to draw them away from the main buildings, engage them on ground of our choosing." "You're talking about an ambush," Marshal Hayes said quietly. "I'm talking about survival. 6 armed men against 2 isn't favorable odds under any circumstances. We need every advantage we can create." Susanna listened to the men discuss strategy, with growing understanding of what Gabriel was planning. He intended to use his military experience to turn their small homestead into a battlefield, with himself as the primary defender. The thought of Gabriel facing such danger for her sake made her chest tight with fear. "There's something else," Marshal Hayes said reluctantly. "During questioning, your father mentioned that he hid a bundle of letters in your mother's trunk." Letters that Morrison is particularly eager to recover. What kind of letters? Susanna asked. Correspondence between Morrison and a territorial judge who's been taking bribes to fix trials. If those letters become public, they could bring down a corruption ring that reaches all the way to the territorial capital. Morrison will do anything to get them back. Gabriel stopped pacing. Where is your mother's trunk now? In the storage shed behind the cabin. I moved it there when I reorganized the bedroom. Susanna felt pieces clicking together in her mind. These letters, they're evidence of crimes beyond just the bank robbery. Evidence that could put a dozen powerful men in prison, including Morrison himself. He's not just coming for revenge or money, Miss Whitfield. He's coming to protect his entire criminal organization. The weight of this revelation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They weren't just dealing with angry criminals seeking revenge. They were facing men who would kill to protect a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Marshal, Gabriel said after a long moment, I need you to do something for me. What's that? Gabriel looked directly at Susanna as he spoke. I need you to take those letters and get them to federal authorities in Denver tonight. Ride hard and don't stop until you reach safety. That would leave you here alone to face Morrison's gang. It would ensure that even if something happens to us, the evidence survives to bring these men to justice. Marshal Hayes nodded slowly. It's the right thing to do, but I don't like leaving. You two to face this alone. We won't be completely alone, Gabriel said quietly. I have friends in these mountains, men who served with me during the war, who understand what it means to stand together against impossible odds. Susanna looked at Gabriel with new understanding. You've been planning for something like this. Not specifically this, but yes. A man doesn't survive what I've survived without learning to prepare for the worst-case scenario. As the day wore on, Gabriel revealed the extent of his preparations. Hidden caches of weapons and ammunition placed strategically around the property. Escape routes mapped and practiced. Most surprisingly, a network of former soldiers living throughout the mountain territory, men who had served with Gabriel and remained loyal to their old sergeant. By evening, 3 of these men had arrived at the homestead, weathered veterans, who greeted Gabriel with the easy camaraderie of shared hardship and mutual respect. Each man brought his own weapons and hard-won experience in fighting desperate battles against superior numbers. Tom, Frank, William, Gabriel introduced them to Susanna. Good men who've stood with me before when the odds were against us. Tom, the eldest of the 3, studied the wanted posters with professional interest. Morrison's gang, eh? Heard tell of them. Vicious bastards, but not particularly bright tactically. They rely on overwhelming firepower and intimidation. That gives us an advantage, Frank added. They won't expect organized resistance from what they think is just a homesteader and a young woman. William, who seemed to serve as the group's scout, had already been reconnoitering the approaches to the homestead. Best defensive position is the ridge overlooking the main trail. Good sightlines, natural cover, multiple escape routes if things go badly. As night fell, the men finalized their plans with the methodical precision of experienced soldiers. Susanna found herself assigned a crucial role, not as someone to be protected, but as an active participant in their defense. Gabriel had taught her to shoot during their quiet months together, and she had proven surprisingly accurate with both rifle and revolver. The most important thing, Gabriel told her as they prepared for what might be their last peaceful night, together, is that you understand what we're fighting for. This isn't about money or revenge. This is about the right to live free from the threat of violent men who believe they can take whatever they want from whoever they choose. Susanna touched the silver locket at her throat, thinking of her mother's courage in choosing love over security, her father's cowardice in choosing crime over honest struggle, and her own decision to stand and fight rather than flee to safety. I understand, she said quietly, and I'm ready. As she settled into what might be her last night in the bed Gabriel had provided for her, Susanna realized that whatever tomorrow brought, she was no longer the frightened, unwanted girl who had been traded away like livestock. She had become a woman willing to fight for the life she had chosen, standing beside a man who had shown her what it meant to be truly valued. The morning would bring violence and danger, but it would also bring the chance to prove that love and loyalty were worth defending, no matter the cost. The attack came at dawn, just as Gabriel had predicted. Susanna woke to the sound of the bronze bell he had rigged as an early warning system, its urgent tolling cutting through the morning silence like a blade. She dressed quickly in the practical. Her clothes Gabriel had suggested, dark colors that wouldn't show dirt or blood, sturdy boots that would allow her to move quickly over rough ground. From her bedroom window, she could see 6 riders approaching through the early morning mist, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. Even at a distance, their intent was unmistakable. They rode with the purposeful confidence of men accustomed to taking what they wanted through violence. Gabriel appeared at her door, his face painted with the calm focus she had learned to associate with his military bearing. "Time to go," he said quietly. "Remember everything we discussed." They moved swiftly to their predetermined positions. Gabriel and his 3 companions took cover on the ridge overlooking the main approach, while Susanna positioned herself in the stone root cellar behind the cabin, protected from gunfire, but with a clear view of the yard through carefully placed rifle slots. Gabriel had cut into the wooden door. The riders approached cautiously, clearly expecting some form of resistance. The man in the lead, tall and lean with the cruel face from the wanted poster, had to be Jake Morrison. He held up his hand, stopping. His companions just outside rifle range of the cabin. "Whitfield," Morrison's voice carried easily across the morning air. "We know you're in there. Send out the girl and we'll make this quick." Silence answered him. Gabriel had instructed everyone to wait until the gang committed to their attack before revealing their positions. Morrison tried again. "We just want what's ours, the money your father stole, and certain papers he might have hidden here. Give us what we came for, and nobody has to die." When silence continued to greet his demands, Morrison's patience visibly frayed. He gestured to 2 of his men, who began circling toward the back of the cabin, while the other 3 prepared to assault the front directly. This was the moment Gabriel had been waiting for. As the gang split their forces, he gave a low whistle, the signal for the ambush to begin. The first shot came from Tom's rifle, taking one of the circling riders from his saddle with lethal precision. The man hit the ground hard and didn't move. Before his companions could react, Frank and William opened fire from their concealed positions, their bullets forcing the remaining riders to seek whatever cover they could find. Morrison proved his reputation for cunning by immediately recognizing that he was facing organized resistance rather than simple homesteaders. "Military formation," he shouted to his men. "We're dealing with professionals." The gang responded with disciplined fire, using their horses as mobile cover while they attempted to identify their attackers' positions. Morrison himself rode hard toward the cabin, clearly intending to use dynamite to flush out anyone hiding inside. This was Susanna's moment. As Morrison approached the cabin's front door, she steadied her rifle against the doorframe of the root cellar and took careful aim. Gabriel had taught her to shoot, but more importantly, he had taught her when shooting was necessary. Morrison was reaching for the dynamite in his saddlebags when Susanna's bullet took his horse in the chest. The animal went down hard, pinning Morrison's leg beneath its weight and leaving him exposed in the middle of the yard. "Got him!" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. Gabriel's answering shot eliminated another of Morrison's men, evening the odds considerably, but the remaining 3 gang members proved resourceful, using the terrain and morning shadows to work their way closer to the defenders' positions. The battle became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with both sides maneuvering for advantage among the rocks and scrub brush surrounding the homestead. Gabriel's military experience proved invaluable. He seemed to anticipate the gang's movements, positioning his men to counter each attempted flanking maneuver. But the tide turned when one of Morrison's men managed to work his way close enough to Tom's position to engage him in close combat. The sounds of their struggle carried clearly across the battlefield, grunts of effort, the ring of metal on metal, and finally a cry of pain that ended abruptly. When the struggle ended, Tom didn't rise from his position. "Tom's down!" Frank called out, his voice tight with emotion. Morrison, meanwhile, had managed to free himself from beneath his dead horse. His left leg was clearly injured, but he was still mobile and still dangerous. He had retrieved his dynamite and was working his way toward the cabin with murderous intent. Gabriel made a decision that would define the rest of the battle. Instead of maintaining his defensive position, he rose from cover and began moving down the slope toward Morrison, drawing the gang leader's attention away from the cabin and toward himself. "Morrison!" Gabriel's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Your fight is with me. Leave the woman out of this." Morrison turned toward Gabriel with a smile that promised death. "Then come and get me, soldier boy." The certain final phase of the battle was about to begin, and Susanna realized that everything she had come to value in her new life now hung in the balance of what happened in the next few minutes. Gabriel moved down the slope with the fluid precision of a man who had spent years learning how to stay alive in desperate situations. Morrison tracked his progress with the cold patience of a predator, but Gabriel's tactical movement made him a difficult target among the rocks and sparse vegetation. The remaining two gang members tried to coordinate their attack with Morrison's, but Frank and William kept them pinned down with accurate rifle fire. The sound of gunshots echoed off the surrounding mountains like thunder, punctuated by the sharp crack of bullets striking stone. Morrison lit the fuse on his first stick of dynamite and hurled it toward Gabriel's position. The explosion sent dirt and rocks flying, but Gabriel had anticipated the move and rolled away from the blast zone just in time. The concussion left his ears ringing, but he emerged from cover with his rifle ready. "You can't hide forever, Stone," Morrison called, out, lighting a second stick. "I've got enough dynamite to level this whole ridge." But Morrison had made a critical error. In his focus on Gabriel, he had forgotten about Susanna. As he prepared to throw the second stick of dynamite, she emerged from the root cellar with her rifle trained on his center mass. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice carrying across the battlefield with surprising authority. Morrison spun toward her, the burning dynamite still in his hand. For a moment, the tableau held: an injured outlaw with a live explosive, a young woman with a rifle, and a veteran soldier calculating the odds of survival for all involved. "You don't have the stomach for this, girl," Morrison sneered. "You're not a killer." "You're right," Susanna replied steadily. "I'm not a killer, but I am someone who protects what she loves." The simple declaration seemed to surprise Morrison. In his world, people fought for money, revenge, or simple survival. The idea of fighting for love was foreign to his experience. Gabriel used Morrison's momentary distraction to close the distance between them. In one fluid motion, he tackled the outlaw around the waist, driving both of them to the ground just as Morrison released the dynamite. The stick flew wild, exploding harmlessly against the side of the barn. The two men rolled in the dirt, grappling for advantage. Morrison was younger and desperate, but Gabriel had the training and experience of a professional soldier. More importantly, he was fighting to protect someone he had come to love, which gave him strength that went beyond physical capability. The fight was brief, but vicious. Morrison managed to draw a knife and slashed at Gabriel's ribs, opening a wound that immediately began bleeding freely. But Gabriel's counterstrike was decisive, a precise blow to Morrison's throat that left the outlaw gasping and unable to continue fighting. As Morrison lay defeated in the dust, the sounds of battle gradually faded. Frank and William had succeeded in eliminating the remaining gang members, though William had taken a bullet in the shoulder that would require attention. Susanna ran to Gabriel's side, pressing her hands against his bleeding wound while he struggled to catch his breath. "How bad is it?" she asked, trying to keep panic out of her voice. "I've had worse," Gabriel managed, though his face was pale from blood loss. "The important thing is that it's over." Frank approached them, his rifle still ready despite the apparent end of hostilities. "Morrison's still breathing. What do you want to do with him?" Gabriel looked down at the man who had brought violence to their peaceful homestead. Morrison was clearly dying. Gabriel's blow to his throat had done internal damage that couldn't be repaired without medical attention. That wasn't available. "Make him comfortable," Gabriel said quietly. "No man should die alone in the dirt, regardless of what he's done." Morrison's eyes widened at this unexpected mercy. With his last breath, he whispered something that sounded like gratitude. As the immediate danger passed, Susanna helped Gabriel back to the cabin, while Frank and William secured the battlefield and saw to their wounded comrade. The bronze bell that had warned them of the attack now rang again, this time as a signal that they had survived. Inside the cabin, as Susanna cleaned and bandaged Gabriel's wounds, they spoke quietly about what had happened and what it meant. "And for their future. You saved my life out there," Gabriel said, wincing as she tightened the bandage around his ribs. "You saved mine first," she replied, "many times over, in many different ways." Gabriel reached up and touched her face gently. "Susanna, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said before we faced this danger." She looked into his dark eyes and saw something there that made her heart race. "What is it?" "I love you, not as an employer or protector, but as a man loves a woman he wants to spend his life with. I know the circumstances of how we met make this complicated, but—" She silenced him with a gentle kiss, pouring all of her own feelings into that simple contact. When they separated, she smiled at him with the radiance that had been growing in her ever since she discovered her own worth. "Then we should probably make this arrangement permanent," she said softly. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over the mountains, illuminating a homestead that had been tested by violence but had emerged stronger for the trial. And in the cabin, two people who had found each other against all odds began planning a future built on love, respect, and the knowledge that together they could face whatever challenges life might bring. 5 years later, the homestead had grown into something that would have been unrecognizable to the modest operation Gabriel had built as a solitary man. The original cabin had been expanded into a proper house with multiple rooms, wide porches, and glass windows that caught the mountain light. The barn was larger now, housing a growing herd of horses that Gabriel bred and trained for sale throughout the territory. Most importantly, the property hummed with the sounds of family life. Susanna Stone, she had taken Gabriel's name in a simple ceremony conducted by Judge Harrison the previous spring, stood on the front porch watching her husband work with a young colt in the corral. At 22, she had grown into the beauty that had always been there beneath the surface. But more than that, she had grown into a woman of quiet confidence who commanded respect throughout the region. In her arms, she held their 6-month-old son, Daniel, whose dark hair and serious eyes marked him clearly as Gabriel's child. The baby clutched a small toy in his chubby fists, a carved wooden horse that Gabriel had made during the long winter evenings, working the wood with the same careful attention he brought to everything important in his life. The toy horse was a deliberate echo of the one Gabriel had shown her on her first day at the homestead, but this one was different. Where the original had been a memorial to loss, this new horse represented hope and continuity. It spoke of a man who had learned to create new joy rather than simply honoring old sorrows. "He's going to be a fine horseman," called Tom Fletcher, from his seat on the porch steps. Tom had recovered from his wounds during the battle with Morrison's gang, though he walked with a slight limp that reminded everyone of the price they had paid for their peace. He had become a regular fixture, At the Stone homestead, helping with the horse operation and serving as an unofficial grandfather to young Daniel. "He'll be whatever he chooses to be," Susanna replied, with the gentle firmness that had become her trademark. "Horse trainer, scholar, shopkeeper. As long as he's honest and kind, that's all that matters." The sound of approaching riders drew their attention to the main trail. Susanna recognized Marshal Hayes even at a distance, his official bearing unmistakable. Behind him rode two other men she didn't recognize, but their formal dress suggested government business. Gabriel emerged from the corral, automatically positioning himself between his family and the approaching strangers. 5 years of peace hadn't erased his protective instincts, though they had been tempered by the confidence that came from knowing he was no longer alone in the world. "Marshal Hayes," Susanna greeted the lawman as he dismounted. "What brings you so far from town?" "Good news, Mrs. Stone. Very good news indeed." The marshal's smile was genuine as he approached the porch. "I'd like you to meet Federal Judge William Crawford and Territorial Attorney Samuel Morrison. No relation to Jake Morrison," he added quickly, noting Gabriel's sharp look. Judge Crawford stepped forward with the dignity of his office. "Mrs. Stone, Mr. Stone, I've come to personally thank you for the service you provided to the territory 5 years ago. The evidence your father provided, combined with the documents you recovered, led to the conviction of 12 corrupt officials and the dismantling of the largest criminal conspiracy in territorial history." "We did what anyone would have done," Gabriel said quietly. "No," Attorney Morrison interjected. "You did what very few people would have the courage to do. You stood against overwhelming odds to protect not just your own interests, but the interests of justice itself." Judge Crawford reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking document. "The territorial government has authorized me to present you with a reward for your service. The sum of $5,000, along with clear title to an additional 1,000 acres of grazing land adjacent to your current property." Susanna felt Gabriel's surprise in the way his posture shifted slightly. $5,000 was a fortune by frontier standards, enough to secure their family's future for generations. "There's one more thing," Marshal Hayes added with obvious pleasure. "Your father's case has been resolved. Oliver Whitfield served 3 years in federal prison and was released last month for good behavior. He's asked me to deliver this letter to you." Susanna accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Inside, she found a letter written in her father's familiar script, but with a steadiness that spoke of sobriety and reflection. "My dear daughter, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I hope you can find it in your heart to know that I am proud of the woman you have become. I spent 3 years thinking about the ways I failed you and the ways my grief over your mother poisoned the love I should have shown you. You deserved a father who could see your worth, not one who blamed you for losses that were never your fault. I hear you have married well and built a good life. That brings me more peace than I deserve. If you can find it in your heart, know that your mother would be proud of the strength and kindness you have shown. I will not impose on your new life by asking to see you, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I was too broken to see then. You were never a burden. You were a gift I was too foolish to treasure. May God bless you and your family. Your father, Oliver Whitfield." Susanna read the letter twice, feeling the weight of years of pain and resentment slowly lifting from her shoulders. The apology didn't erase the damage that had been done, but it provided something she hadn't realized she needed: acknowledgement of her worth from the man whose rejection had shaped so much of her early life. "Is everything all right?" Gabriel asked quietly, reading the emotion in her face. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. "Everything is exactly as it should be." After the official visitors left, the family settled into their evening routine. Gabriel read aloud from a book of poetry, while Susanna nursed the baby and worked on a quilt that would become Daniel's Christmas present. Tom dozed in his chair by the fire, occasionally offering commentary on Gabriel's dramatic interpretation of the verses. As the evening wound down and Tom made his way to the small cabin they had built for him near the main house, Gabriel and Susanna sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountains. "Do you ever regret it?" Gabriel asked, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "The way everything happened, being traded away like property, ending up here with a man you barely knew?" Susanna considered the question seriously, as she always did when Gabriel asked. Something important. She thought about the girl she had been, frightened, unloved, convinced of her own worthlessness. She thought about the woman she had become, confident, cherished, secure in her own value and the value of the life she had built. "I regret the pain that brought us together," she said finally. "I regret that your family died, that my father's. Grief made him cruel, that we both had to suffer loss before we could find each other. But I don't regret where we ended up." Gabriel nodded, understanding the distinction. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if your father had found someone else to take you in. If you had gone to a different household, met a different man." "But I didn't," Susanna said simply. "I came here to you, to this life we've built together. And that's what matters." In the distance, they could hear the gentle sounds of their horses settling for the night, the soft breathing of their sleeping son, and the whisper of wind through the pines that surrounded their homestead. These were the sounds of home, of family, of a future built on love rather than mere survival. Gabriel reached into his pocket and withdrew the original wooden horse he had shown her on her first day, the one he had carved for the child who had never lived to play with it. For years, it had remained in his room, as a reminder of loss. Tonight he placed it gently in the cradle beside their sleeping son. "For Daniel to remember where he came from," Gabriel said quietly, "and to understand that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the deepest sorrows." Susanna touched the silver locket at her throat, her mother's locket, which had taught her that love could transcend death and connect generations. Someday she would give it to Daniel's wife, along with the story of how two broken people had found each other and built something whole. As they prepared for bed, Susanna reflected on the journey that had brought her from Oliver Whitfield's unwanted daughter to Gabriel Stone's beloved wife. It had been a path marked by cruelty and kindness, loss and discovery, fear and courage. But most of all, it had been a path that led to understanding her own worth, not as defined by others' expectations or limitations, but as measured by her own strength, kindness, and capacity for love. The girl who had once been called ugly and worthless had become a woman who knew herself to be beautiful in all the ways that truly mattered. And the man who had seen that beauty when no one else could had become her partner in creating a life that honored both their struggles and their triumphs. In the quiet darkness of their bedroom, as Gabriel's breathing settled into the rhythm of peaceful sleep, Susanna smiled and closed her eyes, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person who valued her as she deserved to be valued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but it would find them facing the future together, as they always had and always would.